exciting. I'd like to thank the speaker for his recognition and indeed everybody in attendance. It is such an honor to be standing before you today. I would also like to thank my partner, Jason Lear, who's reminiscent. The fact that I did not recognize yesterday was his 23rd birthday. Aww. It's an honor to celebrate it with you today, my friend. That being said, we need to turn to this resolution because it is indeed an important one specifically for this community. We see this resolution as a resolution about the preservation of liberty, not the overall destruction of it. And we're going to explain that to you by examining 3 specific points. First, we need to take a look at what free speech is and the limits that it has. Secondarily, we'll take a look at the speech that we're being given today, the speech regarding terrorist violence, and how it fits these limits that must be imposed on free speech. And then finally, we'll take a look at how this indeed can be an effective tool. We're going to examine this resolution under the following premise. We believe that countries like the United Kingdom and the United States do have the right to prosecute radical criticals preaching radical violence. This has been going on in the United States and in the United Kingdom in this ongoing war on terror, and we on the proposition side stand proud to defend these tactics in order to preserve the peace and the stability of their own nations. Not at this time. So first, let's take a look at what free speech is and what the limits of that speech are going to be. No right is inalienable. I think that is very, very clear at the fact that right now I could not scream in a panicked voice, fire, and watch everybody try to clamor over each other to escape this room. That is something I could be persecuted for because what it does is it jeopardizes the liberty, the comfort, and the safety of everybody in this room. Yes, go ahead.
Like if you shout fire, then that would directly precipitate people running out of the room because they will panic. There is no guarantee on your wall, or there is no mechanism on your wall to guarantee that talking about terrorism and advocating terrorism actually leads anyone to carry out terrorism.
Right. Well, we'll talk about talking about terrorism because we realize this is not a debate about speaking about terrorism. It's a debate about speaking about violence, and we think that that's a very, very clear line that's going to be drawn as the debate continues. Not at this time, sir. So we realize the reason that we cede freedom to our governments, the reason we give them the abilities to take away our rights, to put us in jail, to take our money and put them towards taxes, is so that they can defend our liberties. And we have to understand that it is absolutely essential for them to have the ability to take away certain liberties from other people when they see that those liberties will indeed take away the rights of other people. Not at this time. We think that any speech that openly advocates violence and advocates destruction, which is this kind of speech specifically within the resolution, fits this mold, and that's what we're going to discuss right now, is what does that mean? What kind of speech is that? So now that we understand the limits of free speech, we need to take a look at how this kind of speech fits this mold. No doubt the question is going to come up, how do you define a terrorist? Because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We don't think that debate really needs to be had today because we think this speech that specifically discusses terrorist violence. It's not necessarily whether they're standing up and preaching the right of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic Jihad. It's anybody at all that stands up and says any group at all should target another group in open violence, should use destructive tactics and tactics of fear, should threaten the safety and stability of the people. That is the definition that we think is very clearly met and very plain to see when you take a look at the rhetoric. When they say that it is okay to destroy, it is okay to kill, admirable to do these things, we think that it creates such a threat to the other people's liberty that goes beyond whether or not that speech actually incites violence. It creates this environment of fear and this culture of fear that we think leads people to an emotional response, which is to give more power to their government, which governments are known to abuse. Where do we see this? We turn our attention to the United States of America, where right now our federal government is taking away so much of our liberty that if they knew I was criticizing it like this, they would bring Black Hawk helicopters through this roof right now and drag me and Jason from our chairs. We realize that when you have this kind of speech out there, that it is not only encouraging radical, like-minded people to go into subway systems and go into busing systems and blow people to pieces, but it is also creating a culture of fear that will ultimately lead to the consistent destruction of long-term liberty for everybody within that society. It is this kind of liberty that we need to preserve, the liberty of consistency and the liberty of stability. And in order to do that, the government does need to have some kind of check on rhetoric. The third thing we're going to discuss is why this is an effective tool, and we'll talk about the effectiveness and the propensity of rhetoric and why it is specifically we need to check it. The gentleman in the back, please.
Is your side of the house drawing a distinction between inciting terrorist violence and supporting terrorist violence?
No, we think that when anybody stands up and says it is okay, it is good to blow people to pieces, to go into crowded markets where women, children, and non-combatants are, we think that that is one and the same because one, it does encourage that mindset, and two, it does encourage fear, which we think is ultimately destructive towards liberty. The third thing we need to realize in this debate is that this can be an effective tool, that governments can be critical and can be specific in their definitions of this. Governments are not going to just go willy-nilly pulling people off the street. We think that speech that encourages or supports violence is very, very clear and very easy to define. We realize also that we cannot stamp out this rhetoric. We cannot eradicate this rhetoric. People are entitled to their ability to speak. But what we're concerned about is the rhetoric on a mass level and the rhetoric that the government can control. We say, when we take a look at the book written by David Domke, a University of Washington professor entitled God Willing, that when you put someone in a pulpit, it gives them a unique position of authority over the masses. We say this not just because it's self-fulfilling to me right now, but also because it's true. It's proven that when you stand someone up in front of a crowd, they can convince them to do practically anything. We don't necessarily think that this is bad unless it is the destruction of other people's liberty and other people's lives. That's where we draw the line, and that's where all rights have been drawn since the beginning of the recognition of rights. So we realize that we need to force this rhetoric from the pulpit. We need to eradicate the rhetoric that says that it's okay to be destructive towards other people's lives. Because if you don't, it creates a very destructive environment for those people and their future within their governments. We do need to preserve the freedoms of everybody, and in order to do that, there must be some check on the type of rhetoric that is allowed. No doubt there will be questions as to what kind of rhetoric and who is a terrorist, but when they ask that question, go back to the rapid response. Is it inciting or supporting violence? Is it saying that it's okay to be destructive? Now, if that answer is yes, then we think it falls plainly on our side, because we think it directly fits the mold of the kind of rhetorics that we have shown to you today in this speech to be destructive and threatening to the rights and liberties of the people within that nation. Governments have a right and an obligation to protect the freedom of their people and to protect the safety of their people. In order to do that, it is imperative that they have the ability to take away freedoms from some people. And we argue that this should only happen in the most dire of rights. But we think that any speech supporting terrorist violence is one of those situations. So for the first time today, we are proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, sir, ladies and gentlemen, I thought the most stunning thing about the first proposition case here today was in restricting a pretty big and fundamental right of many people. They provided us with absolutely no mechanism or safeguards under which they were going to do it. We think that's slightly problematic, because we would like to argue, firstly, who it is that is going to decide on whether or not a prosecution is taken. Is it going to be the person who was being criticised in the first place? And if it is, we say that may be a bad idea. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, what safeguards are there going to be in place to prevent this? But they also set the model, I thought, in a slightly strange context, in the sense that they set it in the United Kingdom and the United States. But we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, if the problem with Islamic terrorism is people coming from other countries and blowing themselves up in the United Kingdom or the United States, then we think this isn't really going to go very far to solve the problem. So we think that just dealing with the issue of radicalization within Western countries is not necessarily appropriate. But ladies and gentlemen, let me get into what we had from first proposition. First proposition, ladies and gentlemen, argued that there was a link between radical clerics and terrorist activities, that people could be convinced to do pretty much anything. And I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, I'll go on to argue in my point on the sources of terrorism, that we don't think the radicalization necessarily takes place in public. And if we look to examples of people who have been radicalized, like the 7/7 bombers in London and the 9/11 bombers in the United States, those people tended to be radicalized very much in private. So banning public advocacy of terrorism doesn't actually serve to solve this problem at all. No thank you, take a seat. And then we had a point, a POI brought up by the second opposition team, and they raised the question of, are you just talking about people who advocate acts of terrorism or people who support it? And the answer we didn't think was very clear. What happens if somebody says they think terrorism is an understandable expression of disenfranchisement? Because that's something people say all the time. These people don't necessarily agree with terrorism or think it's a good thing. But we argue that it's not clear under proposition whether or not those people would be being criticise.
Sir.
We also say, ladies and gentlemen, that we believe the Speaker is incorrect in saying that we always give the government rights to restrict our rights, that we give the government carte blanche to restrict our rights whatever we want. If we look at the US Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, and in particular at the Second Amendment, the reason that there is a right to bear arms is precisely so that people can defend themselves against the encroachment of government on their liberties and on their rights. And what we argue, ladies and gentlemen, is I don't believe it's an absolute principle that the government gets to decide at any point in time what rights ought to be restricted and what rights ought not. Particularly, ladies and gentlemen, when the criticism is directed precisely at that government. We think it's entirely inappropriate for governments to decide when individuals, and I'll take you on this in a second, Joe, when individuals who are themselves criticising those governments are in fact people that ought to be thrown in prison. And I'll take you now.
But when you have very clear examples, parties like the Party Liberation, the HG, for whatever, not only advocating rights, but also openly supporting things like the Senate and lawmakers in London, what do you do with those groups? Do you allow them to continue that support?
Yes, under side opposition, we would allow them to continue that support because, ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe that that's what led to the violence in the first place. And that takes me neatly on to my first point, which is dealing with the issue of the sources of terrorism. I'll later go on to further deal with issues of the causal mechanism, and Patrick will go on to deal with the hypocrisy underpinning the banning of the right to free speech in order to enable people to enjoy their rights. But we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that it's precisely a feeling of disenfranchisement that leads to a growth and a spread of terrorism. We would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that if you look to the example of the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, it was precisely an army set up to protect what was a disenfranchised community. A group of people, no thank you, take a seat, who felt, ladies and gentlemen, that their rights and their liberties were not being respected. Similarly, ladies and gentlemen, we would argue that that is the perspective taken by groups like Hamas and taken by groups like the Tamil Tigers. But ladies and gentlemen, in advocating the rights of these groups and their political and religious leaders to advocate terrorism, we do not, ladies and gentlemen, necessarily agree that terrorism is a good thing. I just want to get that out of the way in case somebody accuses me of it later on. What we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, is by further restricting the rights of their political and religious leaders to express their beliefs or to advocate anything at all, we just reinforce the feeling of disenfranchisement, ladies and gentlemen. We reinforce the feeling on the part of these people that their rights are not being restricted, that their liberties, ladies and gentlemen, are not the same as those of the majority groups that they feel are oppressing them. And if we look to the example of Saudi Arabia, ladies and gentlemen, we can see a recent rise over the last 5 to 10 years in support for Islamic extremism. But what we don't see accompanying that, ladies and gentlemen, is any increase in rhetoric against the United States or against the Saudi government. We see it tracking a change in socio-economic trends within that country. We see, ladies and gentlemen, that when people feel more disenfranchised, when people feel more like they're not getting their slice of the economic pie, that is when terrorism is likely to increase, and not necessarily when people are advocating it publicly. But I also ask, ladies and gentlemen, in a point of information, and this comes on to my second point, how it is that you can prove that someone standing up and publicly saying that terrorism is an acceptable way to fight for a political struggle, that necessarily leads to further terrorism. And what we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is no evidence brought up by side opposition that that is the case. What we would argue is that it is precisely private radicalisation that tends to lead to a spread of terrorism. No, thank you, take a seat. It's precisely, ladies and gentlemen, the clerics who don't necessarily publicly advocate terrorism, but who do it in private, ladies and gentlemen, either within their own mosque communities or, ladies and gentlemen, abroad, that gather together groups of individuals, ladies and gentlemen, who they radicalise and who they send out in secret. Because it's not particularly useful for a terrorist group, ladies and gentlemen, if everyone knows who their members are, because they're the pretty people turning up to the rallies every week. If we look to the examples of the 9/11 terrorists, for instance, these people were not considered, even by their closest relatives and closest friends, to be radical Muslims. These were people, ladies and gentlemen, who everyone just thought were, average Joe in the street. We don't necessarily believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we can stop and we can interdict terrorism by necessarily preventing public speech. The problems of terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, need to be dealt with entirely differently. They need to be dealt with either at the root cause of dealing with the concerns of these groups, which is something that was dealt with in Northern Ireland. Or, ladies and gentlemen, they need to be dealt with by interdicting the specific people who are radicalising on a private basis. But what we would argue is this proposal does not serve to do that. What this proposal does serve to do is further marginalise and further radicalise groups. What it serves to do, ladies and gentlemen, is tell entire swathes of people that their rights are not the same as everybody else's. And Patrick will get on to deal with this hypocrisy point later. But what we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, is until the proposition can show us that causal mechanism linking expressions of support for violence and actual committal of violence, and until, ladies and gentlemen, they can explain to us the safeguards they are willing to put in place, I beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank you all so much, and my partner especially, and begin by calling upon Thomas Jefferson, who told us, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. But the fact of the matter is there's a difference between free speech and violent incitement. It does me great injury to have my neighbor preach to the neighborhood youth to blow himself up on my doorstep, which is exactly what's happening around the world. And the fact of the matter is that banning this type of speech is essential for the survival of those who oppose this terrorist violence." I'd like to first point out a few points, rather insufficiencies of the opposition, and then go on to some substantive extensions. They first criticize our mechanism for lack of safeguards and specifics, though I'd point out that we're arguing specifically for a general principle of a right to prosecute, and that moreover, this principle, if it is to apply everywhere, as the opposition wishes, belies the idea that specifics are needed, since each culture needs to determine on its own the specific penalties that are appropriate. Moreover, I'd like to point out that this is not an argument about whether terrorism is understandable, as the opposition wishes to characterize it, but it's specifically as to whether terrorist violence is acceptable and ought to be preached. The government, they argue, does not get to determine what rights get to be enforced and restricted. So what is the government to do? Give out candy? We would argue that's exactly what governments are to do, determine which rights ought to be restricted for the sake of the greater good and the rest of the country. Frankly, I'd like to move on now to my substantive points. First, extending that there is a need to remove those who preach violence against the state, and curtailing hate speech is an essential part of that. The fact is that the opposition is, I was going to say ballsy, that's probably inappropriate on this stage, daring enough to come up and argue that it is not in the case of the London bombers incitement that has led to violence, but it is precisely that incitement and those radical clerics which first brought those young men into the society that sent them to Pakistani mosques. It is precisely that incitement and public argument that allowed them to enter the community where they were indoctrinated with hate and fear and caused the deaths of so many people in this great kingdom. Sir.
None of those bombers attended a mosque which was considered to be led by a radical cleric. They clearly weren't radicalized by the cleric leading the mosque. There may have been someone within the mosque who radicalized them, and that's the person who...
First, sir, we'd argue you're absolutely wrong. They attended those very same mosques in Pakistan, and they learned about that way of life from those very same preachers in the United Kingdom, even if they never attended their mosques directly. It was them who added to their consciousness the notion that destroying yourself and others was utterly acceptable. The fact of the matter is, though, that curtailing hate speech is so essential to the defense of the state, because it does have an absolute right to do so. Abraham Lincoln, to you all, Winston Churchill with a big hat, suspended liberties during the Civil War precisely because it was necessary to do so to guarantee the continuity of the state, including free speech. We'll ask for more examples besides the bomb that just exploded on July 7th. We point to the example of Nazi Germany, or post-war Germany, who has, for the absolute necessity of preventing violence, banned the speech supporting Nazi youth and violence in that regard. It has been essential to their control over that movement and to the prevention of a resurrection of a Nazi-like movement which could very well destroy modern Germany. Yes, sir.
Are you willing to throw someone in jail for saying violence against a politically oppressive regime is bad?
I'm sorry, you have to clarify. Please repeat.
Sorry, are you willing to throw someone in jail for saying violence against a politically oppressive regime is bad?
We are willing to throw someone in jail or guarantee a right to prosecute if you say that you ought to go and kill other people and incite terror. Yes. We'd next like to argue that absolutely no slippery slope exists that could cause a harm against other freedoms. Frankly, civilizations, especially modern ones, have argued and defended free speech thoroughly, while also simultaneously limiting it. I don't often get to say, especially in this realm, that I'm proud of being an American. In fact, I often pretend I'm Canadian when traveling abroad. The fact of the matter is that I am quite proud, regardless of our jokes about the Patriot Act, that we've managed to very thoroughly defend free speech in our country, despite limiting it by preventing yelling fire in a crowded theater, despite an American ban on incitements to violence which cause hatred and fear. And the fact of the matter is that it is very easy to separate limiting terrorist incitement with limiting free speech generally, as societies have done for well over 50 years. I'm sorry, I cannot at this time. But I'd like to make a final extension, pointing out at this point that the opposition has responded almost not at all to all of Aaron's substantive points, in pointing out that a cycle of sectarian fear and strife engulfs a country, which not only hurts civil liberties more generally, but hurts those of the minority that is preaching violence, including those who do not support that philosophy themselves. The opposition dares bring forward the example of Hamas and the IRA, who are apparently fighting to protect their right to argue for terrorism. No, I would argue that it is suppression of their right to argue for a freedom of their own state that is very well the reason they have often resorted to such violence and conducted such violence. And it is by no means a desire to protect the argument for violence itself that motivates terrorist groups such as these. This is an entirely invalid point, and the opposition ignores the cycle that will be created. The fact of the matter is, as pointed out by evidence in this speech, a cycle has begun with incitement leading to violence, but a cycle has been transformed into incitement leading to fear and backlash. Stopping that cycle is essential for all parties in civilization. We recently saw and heard from our friends in Australia about when an angry majority tyrannizes a minority it fears and fails to understand. And one thing utterly failed to be considered by the opposition is those moderates who are hurt in the community, especially in this case, debating a Muslim community, who don't support preachers who support radical violence and hatred. Yet nevertheless, they suffer the discrimination, they suffer the backlash, they suffer the exclusion when those preachers cast one mark upon an entire group of people. And we'd argue that they deserve the very same protections from that type of violence and fear and hatred that everyone else does. But it's also key, if we're concerned about civil rights, to recognize the necessity of preventing governments from going too far, a point utterly ignored by the opposition. That what happens when preachers preach radical violence is that civilizations say, all right, government, I will do whatever the hell you tell me to do. And that fact of the matter is they use that power to curtail further civil rights, as we're perhaps seeing in the United States and the United Kingdom. But ending the cycle before it starts, preventing those radicalized preachers not only from violence itself, but also from creating this backlash is essential for the preservation of modern liberties. We would argue that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as referenced by the Declaration of Independence, are important both for substance and order, because life and protection of it must come first. We realize that asking a debate panel to limit speech is like when George Bush recently asked America to conserve gasoline. But the fact of the matter is that in this case, both are wise and prudent, and we beg you to propose.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. I'm going to go on, as Dara said, to look at the hypocrisy we identify in banning hate speech under the circumstances in which it's been presented by first proposition. First of all, however, I'd like to get straight into what we heard from the last speaker. And I'd like to begin by identifying specifically what it was we didn't hear from the last speaker. What we didn't hear from the last speaker was a response to the vast majority of all the points Dara raised. We didn't hear a response to the question of who decides. We didn't hear a clear elucidation of the safeguards on this model. We also didn't hear a response to the fact that it seems the Second Amendment to the United States, for instance, specifically allows for people to advocate the possibility of violence against the state, precisely to stop the state becoming too powerful. In fact, as far as I can tell, all we did hear was a questioning to some degree of the extent to which the source of violence, the source of terror, is a private affair. I'm going to go on and look at that at a second. The particular response we had to that was a suggestion that one of the other possible alternatives which the proposition might be willing to pallet is that disenfranchisement is an issue. Besides that, all we had was a lot of rhetoric about a cycle having begun, and their having identified that a cycle has begun because they've said it about 20 times, so it must be true. We have no thorough analysis whatsoever why it is specifically that speech, as opposed to socio-economic conditions and so forth, is the cause of terrorism. We see in Saudi Arabia, for example, the strong correlation in the recent rise in the popularity of Islamic extremism has been between the degradation of the socio-economic conditions of Saudis, particularly resulting from higher unemployment because of greater immigration. No, thank you. Speech has remained comparatively, relatively constant, and opinion polls on people's opinions of clerics and so forth have remained relatively constant. In every case, in the case of Saudi Arabia, to give you an example, which the proposition did not, it was entirely the fact that socio-economic conditions changed which resulted in terror. We've had no elaboration whatsoever of their supposed causal link in that regard. Let's look at what they did bring us. Well, they did bring us a question of the idea that another major reason why you actually get terror is the fact that it's espoused privately. And they questioned our example in this respect of the London bombers. We were told that it was precisely, to quote, precisely public argument that resulted in the London bombers doing what they did. We say no, this is precisely what didn't happen. This is why the family, close friends and mosque leaders of all the people who were involved in those bombs appeared in the media afterwards saying they were shocked and surprised, they didn't know what's happened, and it certainly hadn't happened in their mosques. We say, as they acknowledge, what actually happened is that these people were proselytized privately and then went, for instance, to Pakistan, where they were further indoctrinated with ideas of terror. We say their model has no effect on countries like Pakistan whatsoever. The government of Pakistan has loose control, for example, over Islamic extremism. They've already attempted to ban Islamic extremist parties about 20 times, and they just keep resurfacing, and the government can't really do very much about it because Musharraf just gets assassinated if he tries to clamp down too far. So again, we don't see in any sense that their model has a meaningful effect. Indeed, the only example they could give us of where they thought it might have had a meaningful effect in the past was post-Nazi Germany. We say Germany still has the largest problem in Western Europe with the neo-Nazi movement and skinheads beating up Turkish immigrants. So we don't think that's a particularly strong example on your side. Your causal mechanism, frankly, didn't stand up on any level of analysis. I'd now like to move on specifically on what it is I'm going to bring to this debate, which is a question of the hypocrisy we identify in banning hate speech in this way. Because what we try to identify on side opposition, and why it is we think that safeguards were so important and why their elaboration of safeguards ought to have been so important, is we find that identical arguments, the kind they claim they want to ban, are made all over the place. I'll take you in just a second. For instance, we teach Sartre in universities who advocated the possibility against violence against the state and said on certain occasions it would be desirable. Politicians say that they understand terrorist action. I ask you, if a British politician said that they thought terrorist action in Palestine was understandable, and then someone who attempted to carry out a suicide bomb quoted that politician, would that make that politician in some way guilty of proselytizing violence? We say when people give academic narratives that blame violence in Palestine, for example, solely on US foreign policy, I essentially say it's not an independent action, but exclusively a result of the actions of another country. Is that not implicitly saying violence isn't their fault and is the result of something else? Yes, of course it is, and you haven't addressed that, have you?
Sir, I believe we've clearly demonstrated how speech leads to violence and how in Germany much more violence would probably be there if not for this prevention. But do you at 12 points through your side intend to argue some serious harms that would come as a result?
Well, we say it's a necessary harm to restricts free speech in a society that values free speech. And unless you can show a particular benefit that accrues from doing so, then we don't think you have a case. We take free speech to be status quo and believe the burden is very much on you to show a benefit for restricting it, because that's the only circumstance in which we normally do so. We say you simply haven't shown that benefit. The real problem you have is not the content of speech at all, but the circumstances in which it takes place. The fact that there are already people, for other reasons as we've identified, who are willing to carry out terrorism, and the fact that this articulation of it is in some way unsavoury to you. You say in your point of information you believe you've shown there's a link. We don't believe you've shown it at all. And what's more, we've given you examples to the extent that you haven't. Therefore, what we have to accept is that there's also an open debate, as much as there's an open debate about Sartre in universities, for instance, or as much as an open debate in the House of Commons when someone says they understand terrorism. There's also an open debate in the Muslim community. We say it is precisely opening up this debate and not restricting hate speech to private clerics and to people who have a word in someone's ear, which allows the true nature of, for instance, Islam to come through. Because recognise that Islam, for instance, is universally recognised as condemning violence correctly read. We think this should be opened up, and that's how you come to a solution, please.
Okay, but isn't it true that all of those conditions that create all of these angry people don't really amount to terrorism unless there's someone in a pulpit who can galvanize their hatred and who can mass them together in action?
I lose count of how many times you've said that's true. I mean, gather that you think it's true. What I contend is that you haven't presented any evidence to that effect, and there's a substantial amount of evidence to the contrary. We say the way when you do open up the debate, and because the fact that so many clerics, there's another piece of evidence on our side, are willing to come out and say that there's no way Islam supports violence, we say the more that this is opened up, the more people are exposed to both sides of the debate, the better it is. Your side wants to, quote, protect people from dangerous clerics, and protect people from the rhetoric of violence. We don't think that should be seen as protecting, ladies and gentlemen. Let me be quite clear. We think that should be seen as patronising. We think if that open debate can take place in the House of Commons, if the open debate about the possibility of legitimate violence can take place against the state, can take place in universities, it must also be allowed to take place within the Islamic community and with other communities that might advocate violence. Not to do so is simply patronising. It's simply pandering to a specific context at the moment and the fact that people are willing to commit atrocities at the moment. It's in no way consistent with overall tenets of free speech and in no way consistent with resolving those problems. So, ladies and gentlemen, because I've shown you that causal mechanism is non-existent, and because I've shown you that the last thing we want to do is patronise those who already feel disenfranchised by the state, I stand proudly in opposition.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope that no one in this room would support of the right of someone to incite genocide on the radio in the context of Rwanda. We recognize, Mr. Speaker, that there are limits on speech when it comes to inciting violence. But the question in this debate that we want to address on second proposition is the question about supporting violence or justifying violence and whether or not this ought to be banned. And on second proposition, we think this is where the debate lies. We think this is where Harthouse is going to take this round, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to address two questions. One is address the thing that was assumed by opening opposition. Why do we protect free speech? What does the right of free speech encompass? And why is it that we place limits on it? And then second of all, why is it that justifying terrorism falls under the same exceptions to incitement of violence for that limitation? Mr. Speaker, let's look at the nature of free speech. We protect free speech because of vague general things like we like things like democracy, we like things like expression, and more importantly, we like things like human dignity. But the problem with inciting violence, Mr. Speaker, is that the very actions that are incited through violent speech, which we think is conceded in this House to be banned or not allowed, Mr. Speaker, is that that goes against the human dignity. It goes against the inviolable nature of the human person, Mr. Speaker. We think that's very much problematic. So what we want to address is that if there is a type of speech that doesn't directly incite violence, but leads to the exact same outcome as an incitement of violence, we think, Mr. Speaker, that is a sufficient justification for the limitation of that speech. Because we think, Mr. Speaker, it's very problematic when you have an entire society living in fear, or you have, Mr. Speaker, the possibility of a local population who wishes to kill their fellow nationals. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we're actually now going to provide a case study on why exactly justifying terror leads to increased violence and is the same as incitement. We want to mention the case study, Mr. Speaker, of the non-political political party Hizb ut-Tahrir, aka the Party of Liberation, aka the HT, Mr. Speaker. Because opening opposition told us that those in the London bombings had nothing to do with extremist Islam, Mr. Speaker. But in fact, many members of the individuals in the London bombings were members of the HT party, Mr. Speaker. They're part of this organization, a very public organization that was involved in these bombings, Mr. Speaker. What does this party do? This party is sort of smart, because right now they're under the radar precisely because they're kept themselves at an arm's length from violence. They've said, look, we're going to create a cause for what we call Islamic Bolshevism, a class struggle for all Muslims to create what we call an Islamist state and try to bring back Islam to be the dominant religion, as was the time of the Prophet, Mr. Speaker. What they've created is an awareness of class struggle. They've created an awareness of disenfranchisement, and they've suggested and advocated, Mr. Speaker, that violence and overthrowing of governments is the way to do this, Mr. Speaker. These sorts of words have permeated the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. It's why Tony Blair has been trying to ban them, but his party has suggested that it's not the greatest idea. We realize, Mr. Speaker, this is a sort of problem. Because when you have class consciousness, the sort of disenfranchisement that opening opposition talks about is actually exacerbated through this speech. Because people are more aware of the problems that they're going through, and they get more angry, Mr. Speaker. We think this is incredibly problematic. We think that it becomes a more attractive proposition to commit terror, it becomes more likely that people within your borders are going to commit terror, and that's going to lead to more attacks, Mr. Speaker. It's just like incitement. Ivan.
So, Michael, now we want to ban a political party that advocates overthrowing governments through peaceful means.
No. That's not at all what we said, Mr. Speaker. We said that they themselves are not committing any violent actions, and they're nowhere near the Bin Laden fatwa. But what they are doing, Mr. Speaker, is justifying terror. They're saying that, look, terror has a point. Perhaps that you should do it, Mr. Speaker. And then we see people, like the individuals involved in the London bombing, saying, hey, that's a good idea. I'm a member of this group. I'm going to do just exactly that, Mr. Speaker. But we see that if you don't have the support for terror, Mr. Speaker, terror is less likely to happen. We want to talk about the quiet revolution in Quebec, Mr. Speaker, where you had public officials not in favor of terror. And that's why you had the very few terrorist actions that were occurred to be not a successful endeavor, Mr. Speaker. It's because despite the fact that people in Quebec felt disenfranchised, it didn't work because people didn't believe that terror was a legitimate form of action. What we have here, Mr. Speaker, is groups legitimizing terror, which is causing people to sort of say, hey, this isn't such a bad idea, Mr. Speaker. It's also why the Black Panther movement in the United States was marginally successful, Mr. Speaker, because Malcolm X, through his teachings, was seen to have a point in the violent struggle, Mr. Speaker, for Black America. We see that where people think that there's legitimate struggle, these causes remain popular and they remain prolific. But where, Mr. Speaker, we realize they're not an issue, then that is much better for society. Opening opposition says, look, the problem is Pakistan, Mr. Speaker. We agree that Pakistan will always be a problem, but the problem with these parties is that they're now making these issues local issues. The HD party has now made the threat of terror no longer one from abroad that can be controlled through things like immigration and foreign security, but rather a domestic issue, Mr. Speaker, that now has to be dealt with. What did we hear from the opening opposition team? Because it was absolutely hilarious. We heard a lot of falsities that all terrorists come from outside, which is wrong. That all things come in private, which is wrong too, Mr. Speaker. Because we showed you that the HT, which advocates political struggle in an open manner, Mr. Speaker, deal with all these things. And then they said the issue of terrorism is socioeconomic trends and disenfranchisement. The funny thing, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what the HT says. The HT says, look, Muslims, you are an underclass. You need to rise up, not unlike Bolsheviks, Mr. Speaker. It's actually funny because HT is employing the same techniques that the Bolsheviks advocated for violent revolution themselves, Mr. Speaker. We see how well that also worked. When you justify the use of terror, Mr. Speaker, it provides a more likely probability this terror is going to happen, Mr. Speaker. We think that's problematic. We heard the idea, Mr. Speaker, the case studies of Saudi Arabia and London. We showed you, Mr. Speaker, how those case studies are completely irrelevant. They asked the questions about the model, like, what if a politician is quoted, Mr. Speaker? I guess the first opposition doesn't even know that courts deal with hate speech laws already, Mr. Speaker. They deal with the fact that they deal with objective criteria and not subjective criteria. It doesn't matter if someone misinterprets a politician's remarks. Courts can determine these things all the time. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, they say we need to open up the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, when this opening up the debate ends up in increased violence, we've shown you, Mr. Speaker, through actual examples on how legitimizing terror results in increased terror, Mr. Speaker. We think that's the same problem as inciting terror. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, this debate comes down to whether or not there is a legitimate difference between supporting terror and inciting it. We've shown you there's not. We propose.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, well, wasn't that a fine stump speech for Mikey to chair the House on un-Canadian activities? Because we seem to get this idea that now we have all these Muslims under the bed and we had all this paranoia from Mikey. So I'm going to talk today about this distinction between support of political violence and incitement. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why there are some circumstances in which political violence is justifiable, and we're not going to back away from that in second opposition today, and they would want to throw me in jail for it. Thirdly, what I'm going to say is that this will exacerbate grievances within Muslim communities who will feel like a target of these laws. But firstly, I just want to pick out my 4 favourite arguments from the proposition benches today and tell you why they're really, really stupid. Now, what you got from the first proposition? Well, governments are taking too much power, and that's our problem. So the way we're going to stop governments taking away our liberties is by allowing governments to take away our liberties. I think it's pretty clear that that doesn't make sense. And then there's the second favourite argument I got from the first proposition was, well, the problem that you see in Australia at the moment, no thank you, is violence from an ignorant majority against a minority that they don't understand. So what the first proposition wants to do is allow the government, in the name of the majority, to ban statements made by minorities that they don't understand but they think are supporting political violence. And all I've got to say to that is, you know, a well-known Australianism that they should understand because they know so much about Australia, struth. Okay, on to the second proposition. Well, what they said was that we want to ban speech now that undermines human dignity. Not that causes actual harm to people, but just causes harm to their vague notions of dignity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was asked once into debate to propose forced sterilisation of the mentally disabled, which I think is speech that undermines human dignity, but I shouldn't be thrown in jail for it. But this gets me on to this last argument. What was the majority of their extension today? Which was to say that revolutionary organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir are the ones who cause terrorism because a few of the suicide bombers who created those bombings on July 7th were members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Well, what we say is that you can't just ban an organisation because of some of its members. We say if you look at the ideology of Hizb ut-Tahrir, as I brought up in a point of information, yes, it does support permanent revolution like Trotskyites do, but it does it through peaceful means. And we say that in liberal democracies all over the world, we allow parties to advocate those sorts of ideas all the time. One of them's called the Communist Party, which we tried to ban once, but couldn't, because, you know, as long as they're peaceful and as long as they don't incite violence, we shouldn't. And we say that not only were there, you know, the July 7 bombers, members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, so was a Guardian journalist who was a prominent figure within his Muslim community, who did advocate peaceful ideas and who was widely seen as a moderate. You criminalise him and you put him in the same basket as the July 7th terrorists. You criminalise the whole community, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to get onto that in a minute, but this gets me onto my extension today. And that's why we need to draw a distinction between supporting and inciting violence. Because what they've said is that it's good to go off and to say it's good to go and set off bombs in marketplaces is a bad thing. And of course we think that's bad too, but that sounds like inciting violence, not supporting violence. And what we want to talk about here is a couple of counter-examples today, which we think shouldn't be banned. The sorts of things we're talking about are vaguely worded interpretations of scripture from clerics, which quite often the majority does understand, and when these things are vaguely worded, that's not a reason to ban something. Secondly, what we say is that it's statements from prominent intellectuals, like Susan Sontag, who comes out on September 12 and says that the United States, because of its foreign policy, had the attacks of September 11 coming to it. Now, we say that could be construed as supporting political violence, but the reason why we allow it in our democracy is because we think dissent is important, and we don't think that governments are in an appropriate place to decide what's offensive and what's just legitimate dissent. Yes, sir?
Considering that the crux of your case relies on this loss of free speech, how do you possibly defend that? Present evidence that societies like America have both vigorous free speech and preventions on supporting and inciting violence for hundreds of years.
Well, the way we do that is by saying we need to support vigorous speech unless you can show real harms. And what we've shown you is that you actually exacerbate the problems. Thirdly, the types of things we're talking about here are Muslim groups who say the insurgency in Iraq is justified. And we think that's important to the debate in Iraq because it's important that Muslim groups make a contribution to that about the costs and benefits of being in Iraq. And this gets me onto the second idea today. Sometimes we do accept that political violence is justifiable. And we brought this up in a point of information. It's justifiable against politically oppressive regimes. So we say it's fine if you're in the West during the 1980s to say that the type of violence committed by the ANC was justifiable. Some people think that the violence committed by the PKK or the IRA or the Tamil Tigers is justifiable. And we say, when there's no clear-cut way to make that distinction between, say, supporting the insurgency within Iraq and supporting violence against politically oppressive regime which contributes to debate in the West, you should fall on the side of making sure that you encourage debate. Because we say, otherwise, what you're falling into the trap is of banning offensive speech. And we don't do that for precisely the reason I said before. We sometimes think dissent is useful, and that's why we allow things like Holocaust denial. Second, and this gets me on to the last point today, of why it creates these grievances against communities. Because what we say is that they're criminalising the thoughts of a whole community, because there is this idea in Islamic communities that all Muslims are brothers and sisters and they exist within Ummah. And when you oppress some cleric in that community for a vaguely worded statement that could be seen as supporting terrorism, you criminalise that whole community. What we say is that didn't work in Northern Ireland, that won't work in the West with the problems it faces today, for precisely the reason that our first opposition brought up. Because you taint the ideas of moderates. You say to them, your ideas don't have the robustness to stand up, they aren't faithful to Scripture, they need the support of heathen governments if they're going to be able to stand at all. If you want to encourage moderates and encourage debate, even within groups like Huzbit Tahrir, you can't criminalise that sort of speech and stifle speech amongst communities. So we say you do need to draw a distinction between incitement and violence. Sometimes political violence is justifiable. You shouldn't target these communities, and for those reasons, we beg to oppose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think that we can all agree in this room that curbing terrorism is a laudable goal. And I think equally we could probably all agree that it's worth sacrificing some liberties to do so. The question in this round becomes, is this plan effective, and does it go too far in trying to curb terrorism for the goals that it will actually achieve? So what I'd like to look at is the efficacy of this plan, and I'd like to do that in three ways. I'd first of all like to ask, what causes terrorism? Because first opposition gave us some awfully simplistic and awfully flippant responses to that question, and I think it's a little more complex than that. And second of all, I'd like to ask what makes terrorism attractive for groups. And finally, I'd like to ask, can this policy apply fairly and impartially? What about the ambiguities when you're trying to make these decisions? So first of all, let's ask what causes terrorism. Because what we heard from Dara today is that terrorism is caused by socioeconomic disadvantagement and disenfranchisement. And if that's the case, I'd like to ask, why do people in London, when they're feeling disadvantaged, blow up buses, and people everywhere else don't seem to do it so much? I think it's probably a little more complicated than just you feel disenfranchised, ipso facto, you commit terrorist acts, and that's just the way it happens. What we would tell you in second proposition is that we think there's a correlation between feeling disenfranchised, having someone tell you that the means to end your disenfranchisement is a violent means, and then committing the violent acts. We think there is that link there. That link has to exist because generally speaking, people don't really like the idea of killing other people or blowing up other people. They sort of have to be convinced that it's okay to do so. And we think that's where the real problem comes in. And this is where our analysis about the HT party becomes so important. Because what this does is it draws people in with rhetoric about their religion and their class and the disadvantages they face. And then it tells them that when people try to solve those problems by going out and committing violent terrorist acts, that that's a really good way to solve them, that these people are doing something pretty great, and that we should respect them for it, and that we should think that what they are doing is completely justified. We think that it's in justifying these acts that you create a groundswell of support for them. The terrorists can come in from other countries if you want to bring them in from other countries, and that's something that the immigration policy has to deal with. But the reason that terrorism is used and is attractive is because there is a groundswell of support for it within the disenfranchised communities, and that's what happens when you get these types of groups justifying the terrorist actions being undertaken. We think that's what's so dangerous, and that's what actually causes terrorism. So second of all, what makes terrorism appear attractive? And before I go on to that, I'll take Dara.
And the problem with the HT party, and the reason they remain below the radar, is precisely because they don't publicly advocate terrorism. They radicalize it privately.
No, that's not true at all. There are a number of of clerics within that party that do so publicly. And I guess I may as well respond to what we heard from Ivan that I was going to do later. What he told us is this party doesn't have a public doctrine of supporting terrorism. That's why we're not advocating banning the party, Mr. Speaker. What you do have is several prominent clerics within the party publicly supporting terrorism. Those are the people you need to go after. Those are the people who should be prosecuted by this policy. We think that's a pretty clear solution to the problem. So what makes terrorism attractive? And we would tell you on this side of the house, terrorism is attractive because people think it will work, because it looks like it's going to achieve the aims that they have set for themselves. And that means that you need to have a whole lot of public support for those acts of terror so that people, first of all, shield members of their community who commit the terrorist acts so that it's not as easy to find them. But second of all, so that they pressure the government to give in to terrorist groups, to make concessions to them, to negotiate with them, and to legitimize them as a political actor. So it's not just about clerics privately taking someone aside and saying, will you blow something up for me? It's also about clerics telling everyone in the community, which must be done publicly because they're trying to reach a lot of people at once, that what those people did is okay and is necessary and is justified. And what we brought you was 2 case studies. We talked to you about the Black Panthers in the United States, how there was a very disenfranchised black minority in the United States, and that people like Malcolm X, who justified terrorist acts being undertaken, violent means being used in those cases, helped to legitimize those struggles, helped to create a groundswell of support for those people, and made those acts much more successful, much longer lasting than they would have otherwise been. We also talked to you about the FLQ in Quebec. And what happened in that situation was that you had a political party that decided to undertake terrorist means, things like political kidnappings, in order to try and achieve change for the province of Quebec within Canada. And what we saw is that there just wasn't public support for terrorist actions within Quebec. And so the FLQ ended up being completely delegitimized. It dissolved as far as its presence on the political scene. And instead what you got was peaceful political negotiations as to how you would deal with that situation, how you would enfranchise Quebec. The reason that happened is because you didn't have a lot of people running around Quebec from pulpits telling everyone that terrorism is totally justified. It's fine to blow people up as long as it helps out your cause, as long as it's a righteous struggle. We didn't see that, so you didn't see the public groundswell of support, and so you didn't see these actions being successful. So finally, we'd like to ask, no, I'm sorry, Dara, sit down. Finally, we'd like to ask, will this policy be able to be used fairly and impartially, or is it going to cause massive backlash because it will just be used completely randomly? Before that, I'll take Ivan.
When you target clerics for reflecting behavior, the statements they make in private, it looks like you're targeting them for being part of the group that supports.
No, we're not targeting them for things they say in private. We're only targeting them for things they say in public. If they get up on whatever day of the week that they are preaching to people and say it's totally okay that these people blew up other people in pursuit of this struggle, then we can prosecute them, and then it's very clear what we're doing it for, and it doesn't look so much like we're targeting people randomly. And that was the first objection we heard, that minorities are going to think you're targeting them. And we would say that as long as violence tends to come from minority communities who feel disenfranchised, there will be a certain perception that you're targeting minorities with any policy that is aiming to curb terrorism. But we think that dealing with public speech is one of the least problematic avenues that we can explore in that respect, because it's so public, because we can point to public examples, is not dependent on things like wiretapping that then get claimed were rigged. The second thing we heard is that some people say things like the United States had it coming, and then that would be considered to be supporting terrorism. We see all the time that courts are able to distinguish between hate speech and things that people might think sound a little bit like hate speech. Courts are pretty smart, Mr. Speaker. We think they can do it here too. Finally, what we heard is that people within our communities would support groups struggling against an oppressive regime. And would that count? We would say that if you don't have any other means to express your voice because you don't live in a democracy, maybe that would be okay. But in Western liberal countries where you can use democratic means and you choose not to, there's absolutely no justification for terrorism. We shouldn't allow anyone to make that justification. We're very proud to propose.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. My speech today will be divided into 2 sections. Firstly, I'd like to examine the question of what counts. as supporting terrorism, because this was a particularly important part of our extension in today's debate, because when Jo said right near the end of her speech that we never think it's okay to agitate for violence against anyone, we think that fundamentally demonstrates that she missed the point of our extension in today's debate, which is often there are situations in which it's not only legitimate to violently agitate against oppressive states, but quizzically it's also okay to support people violently agitating against those states. Secondly, I'd like to ask the question of will this work? Because the very laudable goal of life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness that we had from the government benches was all premised on the fact that they felt their model would lead to some type of net reduction in the carrying out of acts of terrorism. And the other part of our extension, which also went under the radar of the opposition in today's debate, was actually our analysis of why creating and passing a law that visibly ostracises and targets an already disenfranchised group will lead to more acts of terrorism and more violence. So, no thank you. Step one, what does count? Well, we had a pretty simple opening government that said the rapid response every time we're asked this question, no thank you, Jo, should be to remember, is this statement supporting violence? Well, yes, it is if it supports violence. And that was the analysis that we had from the opening government. And what we've said is that lots of violence is actually okay to support. For example, no one is going to ever be thrown in jail, no thank you, for supporting the United States' violent invasion of Iraq, for instance. So there's clearly some types of violence that are okay. And what our extension has dealt with in today's debate has been drawing that line. So what we said is when it comes down to classifying what counts as acts of terrorism, we think that, for example, no one should be thrown in jail for supporting the actions of the African National Congress in the 1980s. We don't think that people who support, for example, the Mukawama currently being carried out in Iraq as opposed to the jihad being carried out in Iraq, that's simply a resistance against an occupying force, should necessarily be thrown in jail because that stifles debate. No thank you. What we've said is that there is a net harm to banning these types of speech. Firstly, because the limiting of free speech when it causes no material harms is a necessary harm in and of itself. And secondly, as our extension pointed out, that's going to lead to less public debate in society, and make it easier for people to incite and carry out acts of violence because there is that stifling of debate coming from the minority part. In the extension that we got from Hart House, the only reason why that it was going to be any easier to determine what counted as supporting terrorism was supporting acts that are against human dignity. Well, we think that in itself is a pretty line ball call in today's debate. We think that in oppressive states, there's already problems with the respect of human dignity. We think that, for example, in apartheid South Africa, there are problems with the respect of human dignity, and it's not okay simply to say that any acts agitating to change that situation necessarily offend human dignity. So I'd like to move on now, and I'll take you in a second, to the second area of today's debate. Because what I demonstrated in that section of my speech is that it is important that we can't automatically determine what counts as supporting good and bad acts of violence, and that debate must be played out because the limiting of free speech unfairly is an absolute harm. Sir.
Considering the apartheid regime fell largely because of pressure and diplomacy, because of speech, rather than repulsive and abhorrent acts of violence, how do even in this instance you support that violence directly?
Well, one, I think that's rubbish, and two, if we want to put lots of pressure from the international community on oppressive regimes, big up. That doesn't mean that people who are inside the state being killed on a day-to-day basis shouldn't also do something about the fact that they've been sitting back watching oppressive states slaughter their families. Life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness wasn't a particularly telling sort of phenomenon in South Africa in the 1980s, sir. So we move to the second area. Is this going to increase or decrease on kind of a net level acts of terrorism? Because Jo was right. Attempting to decrease terrorism is indeed a very laudable goal. Now, in the first half, the only analysis we got of why this would decrease terrorism is when people say, go blow stuff up, people go blow stuff up, and if you have them stop saying it, then people will stop doing it. I think we pretty adequately demonstrated that was insufficient analysis insofar as this debate goes. No, thank you. Precisely because deliberately inciting violence is already a crime, which was the subtle distinction the second half of this debate tried to make. And in Mikey's speech, he said that the reason we need to ban supporting acts of terrorism is because groups will sort of subtly use their support as a means of actually inciting violence. And the only real evidence we got there was his Good to Hear, where groups do use their sort of the cover of only being a group that sort of, say, supports rather than incites as a means to incite it. And what we'll say is twofold. Number one, there was enough problems in the first half of this debate demonstrating the link between people actually saying blow stuff up and people blowing stuff up. We think that then proving the link between people abstractly supporting something and people blowing things up is even less likely to be a clear link and a clear delineation between those two things. No thank you, Joe. But further to that, we'd also say, firstly, that we believe the line is very, very clear between simply supporting or saying that an act could be justified and that an act, or saying go and blow things up. We think those lines can be drawn.
Sure.
But more troubling was the analysis that came out that says the reason you need to crack down on his Good to Hear is actually that there's individuals within that group who sort of preach, say, sometimes in Mike's speech in private and sometimes in Joe's speech in public, that preach that we should go and blow things up. And we say, and this was Ivan's point, that when you crack down on those individuals, because of the concept of collective consciousness and the way in which that's perceived as an attack on the whole group, you criminalise a whole lot of other members of that group who don't share those beliefs. So to the question, will this lead to a net increase or decrease in violence? They say stopping speech stops violence. What we've said is that when you ostracise an entire group that's already disenfranchised, when you take into account the specific instance, the specific situation of Muslim groups with their concept of Ummah and collective consciousness, and collective community consciousness, when you take all those things into account, passing laws that disproportionately target that entire group fuels the causes of violence and terrorism. So for all those reasons, this side, in a kind of noble attempt to stop terrorism, have really only wound up ostracising people and causing more terrorism, where we support not only free speech, but peace and, ironically, life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness.